The desert was still wrapped in darkness when the first quiet sounds began to rise along the banks of the Nile. The stars remained scattered across the sky, soft and distant, while a cool breeze drifted over the calm water. It carried the gentle scent of wet reeds and rich black earth, a smell that belonged only to the river after another peaceful night. Far beyond the fields, where the sand slowly climbed toward empty hills, the wind whispered over old stones that had watched countless seasons pass without ever speaking a word. The village rested beneath the fading stars. Rows of mud brick homes stood close together, their flat roofs still cool from the night air. Most doorways remained closed. Inside, families slept on woven mats, wrapped in simple linen cloth. The silence was deep enough that the smallest sounds seemed to float through the streets. Somewhere, a donkey shifted its weight. A dog lifted its head for a moment before settling once again. The world seemed content to remain still for just a little longer. This quiet hour belonged to the people who always woke before the sun. Long before the fields filled with voices and the workshops echoed with steady labor, there were those who preferred the peaceful darkness. Bakers gathered dry bundles of straw beside clay ovens. Fishermen checked the knots in their nets beneath the faint glow of oil lamps. A few women stepped carefully toward the river carrying smooth clay jars balanced against their hips, hoping to collect fresh water before the day's warmth arrived. The Nile itself moved without hurry. It did not rush toward the sea. It simply flowed, as it always had, carrying tiny pieces of distant mountains through its gentle current. The river fed the fields, filled the canals, and gave life to every village that rested beside its banks. Its quiet rhythm shaped every season, every harvest, and nearly every hour of an ordinary person's day. Not far from the village stood a cluster of grain storehouses. Their thick mud brick walls held back both heat and moisture as well as they could. The doors were made from sturdy wood darkened by many years beneath the Egyptian sun. Each morning, before workers arrived to begin their tasks, the buildings stood silent like patient guardians watching over the precious harvest gathered from nearby fields. Grain was more than food. It was comfort during dry months, payment for labor, and security for families who could not know what the next season might bring. Every basket counted. Every measure mattered. Farmers understood this better than anyone. They had spent long days bending beneath the hot sun, cutting golden stalks with simple sickles made from wood and sharpened stone. Their hands carried small cuts from rough straw. Their backs often ached after weeks of harvest. Yet every bundle brought to the village represented another promise that children would eat bread through the coming months. As the eastern sky slowly softened into pale shades of gray and blue, one man approached the storehouses carrying a small wooden tablet and a reed brush tucked beneath his arm. His name was Mena, a village scribe whose work required careful eyes and endless patience. Mena was not wealthy. His home looked much like every other house along the narrow streets. His sandals were worn smooth from years of walking dusty paths between fields, workshops, and storage buildings. Yet his skill with writing gave him an important place within the community. While others carried heavy baskets or guided oxen through the fields, Mena carried numbers, names, and records inside his careful handwriting. He greeted the morning with quiet habit. Before unlocking the first storehouse, he stood for a moment facing the river. The cool air rested gently against his face. Birds hidden among the reeds began singing one by one. Their soft calls mixed with the distant splash of a fisherman pushing his small boat away from shore. Only after this peaceful pause did Mena lift the wooden bar from the heavy door. The hinges groaned softly. Inside, the air felt different. Cooler. Dry. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of early sunlight slipping between small openings high in the walls. Tall baskets filled with grain rested in neat rows. Large woven bins stood shoulder to shoulder, each marked with careful symbols recording where the harvest had come from and when it had been stored. The smell inside was warm and comforting. Dry barley, fresh wheat, woven reed baskets, clay floors swept clean only the evening before. Mena stepped carefully between the rows. He was in no hurry. Every morning followed the same quiet routine. He checked the seals placed across storage doors. He looked for signs of dampness or insects. He counted baskets already promised to bakers, temple workers, and laborers repairing irrigation canals farther south. The routine rarely changed. Perhaps that was why he noticed something unusual almost immediately. One basket near the back wall seemed lighter than expected. He knelt beside it without concern. Sometimes grain settled naturally after being stored. Sometimes woven baskets leaned slightly, changing their shape over time. Nothing about the sight seemed alarming. He reached inside. His fingers sank deeper than they should have. Mena frowned only slightly, not with fear but with quiet curiosity. He gently moved aside the top layer of grain. The basket held less than yesterday's record suggested. He stood and walked toward another basket from the same harvest. This one also seemed lower. Still calm, he opened his wooden tablet and compared yesterday's neat columns of numbers with the grain before him. He counted slowly. Then counted again. Outside, the village continued waking. Smoke curled upward from cooking fires as women prepared the first flat loaves of bread. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while helping sweep courtyards with bundles of reeds. Goats wandered through narrow streets searching for scraps of fresh leaves. Somewhere nearby, the steady tapping of a carpenter's wooden mallet began another day's work. Life moved gently forward, unaware that one careful scribe had paused over a simple question hidden among baskets of grain. Mena did not assume anyone had done wrong. He knew that numbers could be imperfect. Measurements might change. Baskets could shift during storage. Workers sometimes recorded totals after long hours beneath exhausting heat, when tired minds welcomed the comfort of evening shade more than another careful count. So he continued his inspection. Each basket received patient attention. His footsteps stirred tiny clouds of dust across the smooth clay floor. Outside, sunlight slowly stretched across the village walls. The warmth grew stronger with every passing moment. Farmers gathered beside irrigation canals carrying wooden hose over their shoulders. Teams of oxen waited quietly while ropes were adjusted. A pair of brothers laughed softly as they argued over whose donkey walked more slowly. The ordinary morning remained beautifully ordinary. Inside the storehouse, Mena finished his counting. He closed his tablet. The difference was small. Very small. Small enough that another person might have ignored it completely. Yet something about it lingered quietly in his thoughts. Not because many baskets were missing. Not because the village faced immediate hunger. Simply because careful records and careful harvests usually agreed with one another. Today, they did not. Mena stepped back into the bright morning light. He closed the heavy wooden doors behind him and secured them as always. Then he stood listening. The breeze carried the gentle rustling of palm leaves. Someone nearby sang while kneading bread dough. Children chased each other through drifting dust. Life felt peaceful. And somewhere within that peaceful village rested the beginning of a mystery so small that almost no one had noticed it at all. It was not the kind of mystery told by traveling storytellers beneath evening stars. It was quieter than that. It lived inside ordinary days, hidden among baskets, fields, handwritten records, and the simple rhythm of people whose lives depended upon the patient work of every season. Mena took one slow breath before walking toward the fields, his sandals leaving faint prints in the soft earth beside the canals. Above him, the sun climbed gently into the clear Egyptian sky, warming the land once again, while the Nile continued its endless journey, calm and untroubled, as though it had all the time in the world. The morning grew warmer one quiet moment at a time. Shadows that had stretched long across the village slowly became shorter beneath the climbing sun. The cool breeze from the Nile lingered for a little while, brushing softly through the reeds before the familiar heat of another Egyptian day began to settle over the fields. Mena walked along a narrow path beside one of the irrigation canals. His sandals pressed gently into the damp earth where water had overflowed during the night. Tiny frogs slipped into the water as he passed. Dragonflies hovered above the surface, their delicate wings catching the first bright light of morning. He carried no feeling of alarm. Instead, his thoughts moved slowly, almost as quietly as the river itself. The missing grain was not enough to trouble the entire village. It would not leave families hungry. Bakers would still shape their loaves before sunrise tomorrow. Workers would still receive their daily rations. Children would still dip warm bread into bowls of lentils before beginning another day beside their parents. Yet careful records existed for a reason. Every basket had been counted after the harvest. Every measure had been written with patient hands. Every delivery from the fields had passed beneath the watchful eyes of both farmers and scribes. Small differences deserved quiet attention before they became larger ones. Ahead, the fields spread across the dark soil left behind by the Nile's yearly flood. Young barley moved gently in the breeze, creating soft waves of green beneath the bright sky. Beyond them stood taller patches of wheat that had already begun to turn the color of warm honey. Several farmers were already at work. Some loosened the soil around young plants with simple wooden tools. Others cleared small channels that guided water toward thirsty crops. The work was steady and unhurried. Every movement had been practiced since childhood. One elderly farmer straightened slowly, pressing both hands against his lower back before smiling as Mena approached. "Another warm day," he said. Mena returned the smile. "It seems the sun never forgets us." The old man laughed softly, the sound disappearing into the open fields. "It would be strange if it did." For a few quiet moments they simply watched the water moving through the canals. The farmer's name was Hori. His face had grown deeply lined after many years beneath the desert sun. His hands were rough with old scars from harvesting grain, repairing fences, and lifting heavy baskets season after season. He knew nearly every field surrounding the village. He remembered which corner collected more water after the flood, which patches dried first beneath the summer heat, and which families had worked the same pieces of land for generations. Mena asked gently, "How was this year's harvest?" Hori looked across the fields before answering. "Not the largest. Not the smallest. Enough, if the river remains kind." That was often how farmers spoke. They rarely claimed certainty. Too much depended upon the Nile, the weather, insects, and simple fortune. A season could begin with great hope and end with disappointment, or begin with worry and surprise everyone with generous harvests. Nothing belonged completely to human hands. The two men continued walking together beside the canal. Their conversation drifted naturally from crops to fishing, from fishing to families, and from families to the quiet changes that every passing year brought to the village. Only after several minutes did Mena mention the grain. "I noticed something unusual this morning." Hori turned his head slightly. "Oh. The storehouse records are just a little different from the grain itself." The old farmer nodded slowly. "How different?" "Not much." Hori considered this without speaking. Sometimes silence carried more thought than words. Finally he said, "Grain settles. I know. Workers grow tired. I know. Young boys count too quickly." Mena smiled. "I know that as well." Again they walked without speaking. Neither man seemed eager to imagine trouble where none might exist. The old farmer eventually shrugged. "Perhaps tomorrow the numbers will agree again." Perhaps. It was a simple answer. Neither hopeful nor worried. Merely patient. That patience seemed to belong naturally to the people who lived beside the Nile. Everything happened according to seasons. Seeds required time. Bread required time. Children grew slowly. Mud bricks dried beneath the sun one day after another. Even the great river followed its own steady rhythm without ever hurrying. By the middle of the morning, the heat had become stronger. Workers wrapped light linen cloth around their heads against the sunlight. Oxen pulled wooden plows through softer patches of earth. Small birds searched freshly turned soil for insects uncovered by the day's labor. Farther down the canal, several women knelt beside smooth stones washing clothes in cool river water. They spoke quietly while working, their voices blending with the gentle splashing made by wet linen against stone. Nearby, children collected fallen reeds to carry home for cooking fires. Life moved with peaceful purpose. No one appeared rushed. No one wasted movement. Each task belonged naturally beside another, as though every person had learned the rhythm of the village long before they understood its words. As the sun climbed higher, Mena continued toward the granary overseer's house. The overseer was called Beck. Unlike many officials serving larger towns, Beck lived much like everyone else. His home was slightly larger than most, but it remained a simple mud brick house with whitewashed walls and a shaded courtyard where two date palms offered welcome relief from the afternoon heat. Beck was sitting beneath one of those palms repairing the leather strap of a worn sandal. He looked up with a gentle smile. "You are early. I wished to ask about yesterday's deliveries." Beck invited him to sit. The shaded courtyard felt wonderfully cool after walking beneath the sun. A young girl brought each man a small cup of cool water drawn from a clay jar resting in damp sand. The water carried the fresh taste of the river. For a while they spoke of ordinary things. The coming festival. The condition of the canals. Whether enough reeds would be cut before the next flood. Only then did Mena explain what he had found inside the storehouse. Beck listened carefully without interrupting. When Mena finished, the overseer rested his hands upon his knees. "How much is missing?" "A little. Enough to concern you." Mena thought before answering. "Enough to notice." Beck nodded. A careful answer. Again there was no panic. No hurried orders. Only quiet consideration. Beck had watched harvests come and go for many years. He had seen grain damaged by dampness after unexpected rain. He had seen mice find tiny openings beneath storage walls. He had watched baskets shrink slightly as woven reeds dried beneath changing weather. "There are many reasons," Beck said softly. "I agree. We should look before making any judgment." "I hoped you would say that." The two men rose together. Instead of walking directly toward the granary, Beck first visited 3 nearby homes whose families had worked during the harvest. Not because he suspected anyone. Because memory often lived better among ordinary workers than inside written records. At the first house an elderly woman sat outside grinding grain between 2 heavy stones. The steady circular movement had become almost effortless after decades of practice. She greeted both men warmly. Her hands never stopped working. The pleasant smell of fresh flour drifted through the warm air. Beck asked simple questions. Did the harvest seem complete? Were all baskets delivered? Did anyone return later with forgotten loads? The woman answered patiently. She remembered oxen. She remembered children helping carry water. She remembered one broken basket repaired beside the road. Nothing unusual came to mind. At the second home, a potter shaped damp clay upon a simple wheel beneath an open shelter. His hands were coated with soft brown earth. As he worked, smooth walls slowly rose from the spinning clay beneath his fingers. He remembered lending a cart after one axle cracked during harvest week. He remembered dust, heat, long afternoons. He remembered tired laughter as neighbors finished gathering the last fields before sunset. Again, nothing seemed unusual. The mystery remained gentle, almost invisible, as though it wished to remain hidden inside ordinary memories rather than dramatic events. By midday, the village rested beneath the full weight of the Egyptian sun. The dusty streets had become quieter. Many workers sought shade beneath woven awnings or palm trees. Children napped beside cool mud brick walls. Inside homes, bread baked slowly within clay ovens while lentils simmered gently in blackened cooking pots. The smell of warm grain drifted through the streets. Fresh bread always carried comfort. It reminded families that another day's labor had meaning. That fields had answered months of careful work. That tomorrow's meal was already beginning. Mena stood outside the granary once more. He looked across the peaceful village. Nothing appeared different. Nothing suggested hidden secrets. The river shimmered quietly beyond the fields. A fisherman guided his small papyrus boat toward deeper water with slow, practiced strokes. White birds rested along the muddy banks. The world felt exactly as it should. And yet, somewhere between the fields, the baskets, the careful records, and the steady routines of ordinary people, a few handfuls of grain had quietly disappeared. Not enough for fear. Not enough for anger. Only enough to invite patience. So Mena unlocked the heavy wooden doors once again, stepping into the cool stillness of the granary. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight, and the familiar scent of barley and wheat welcomed him back into the quiet room. Beside him, Beck paused without speaking, allowing his eyes to wander slowly across the rows of baskets. Together they began another careful count, not searching for someone to blame, but simply listening, in their own patient way, to what the grain itself might quietly reveal. The cool air inside the granary felt almost hidden from the afternoon outside. Thick mud brick walls held back much of the day's heat, and the silence settled gently over the room like a light blanket. Dust floated through narrow shafts of sunlight that slipped in from small openings high above. Every grain basket rested where it had been placed after the harvest, each one woven from reeds gathered months before along the banks of the Nile. Mena and Beck stood quietly for a few moments before beginning their work. Neither wished to rush. There was comfort in moving slowly. The granary had its own peaceful rhythm, different from the busy streets outside. Here there were no children laughing, no donkeys calling across the village, no steady tapping from the carpenter's workshop. There was only the faint rustle of grain settling inside baskets and the occasional creak of old wooden beams warming beneath the afternoon sun. Beck walked toward the first row while Mena opened his writing tablet. The familiar symbols looked neat and calm across the smooth surface. Each mark represented patient work completed many weeks before. Farmers had measured every basket after long days beneath the harvest sun. Young helpers had carried sacks balanced carefully across their shoulders. Scribes had counted until their eyes grew tired in the fading evening light. Now those quiet records waited to be read once again. Beck rested both hands on the edge of a large basket. "This one came from the eastern fields," he said softly. Mena nodded. "The family of Panaceae." Beck gently lifted the woven cover. The scent of dry barley rose into the cool room. It was a warm, familiar smell that reminded both men of baking bread before sunrise, of fresh flour ground upon smooth stones, and of simple meals shared after long days of labor. Beck reached inside. His hands moved carefully through the grain. Nothing seemed unusual. The basket was clean and dry. No insects stirred among the kernels. No dampness clung to the bottom. Everything appeared exactly as it should. They moved to the next basket. Then another. And another. Time passed quietly. Outside, the afternoon sun drifted slowly across the sky. Workers in distant fields paused beneath small shelters made from woven reeds. Some shared onions, dates, and warm bread before returning to their tasks. Others rested silently, grateful for a few peaceful moments away from the heat. Inside the granary, Mena continued writing small notes beside each careful count. Sometimes he smiled to himself. Writing had always given him a quiet kind of happiness. As a boy he had practiced copying simple signs onto broken pieces of pottery, tracing each shape again and again until his teacher finally nodded with approval. Years later, the careful habit remained. Every line was placed with patience. Every number deserved respect. Beck noticed the smile. "You still enjoy your work?" "I do. Even after so many seasons." Mena looked around the room. "I like knowing that tomorrow begins with today's careful work." Beck considered those words. "That is a peaceful way to think." Mena shrugged gently. "The river keeps flowing whether our records are neat or untidy." Beck laughed softly. "True. But I sleep better when they are neat." Their quiet laughter disappeared into the still air. The village outside continued living its ordinary afternoon. Near the riverbank, fishermen repaired torn nets beneath the shade of acacia trees. They worked with slow hands, weaving fresh cord through worn places one knot at a time. One fisherman hummed an old melody that had likely been sung by his father and grandfather before him. Nearby, small children searched the muddy shoreline for smooth shells. A little farther away, women rinsed vegetables in shallow baskets while talking quietly about the coming market day. The world remained beautifully ordinary. Back inside the granary, Mena noticed something small. Not another missing measure. Not an empty basket. Only a few scattered grains resting near the doorway. He knelt. The grains were clean. Fresh. Almost golden where sunlight touched them. Beck stepped beside him. "What do you see?" Mena held one tiny kernel between his fingers. "It should not be here." Beck looked down. A few grains lying on the floor would not surprise most people. Workers carried baskets every day. Some grain always escaped. Yet Mena's eyes followed the tiny trail across the smooth clay floor. There were only a handful. Then another few. Almost too few to notice. The scattered kernels wandered gently toward the doorway before disappearing beneath its heavy wooden threshold. The two men remained silent. Beck crouched beside the entrance. The doorway was old. The wood had dried beneath many summers. Tiny gaps had appeared where the frame no longer rested perfectly against the floor. He brushed away a little dust with his hand. The opening beneath the door was narrow. Very narrow. Still. It existed. Beck smiled almost to himself. Perhaps. Mena understood. Perhaps grain had slipped beneath the door whenever baskets entered or left the building. Perhaps workers sweeping the floor had missed a few kernels. Perhaps birds had found easy meals waiting outside. It was only a thought. Nothing more. The mystery still rested quietly beneath simple possibilities. Beck stood. "Let us walk outside." The afternoon light greeted them with gentle warmth. The village seemed slower now. Heat encouraged everyone to move carefully. Even the donkeys preferred the shade. Mena looked down near the doorway. The dusty ground showed many footprints. Some were fresh. Others had nearly disappeared beneath drifting sand. Children's small feet. Adult sandals. Goat hooves. The rounded marks left by heavy baskets set briefly upon the earth. Nothing appeared unusual. The wind had softened every edge. It was impossible to know which prints belonged to yesterday or last week. Nearby, an elderly sweeper slowly cleaned the narrow street with a broom made from bundled reeds. She smiled politely as the two men approached. Beck greeted her. "You keep this place cleaner than anyone." She laughed. "The wind always wins." "Perhaps." He pointed gently toward the granary door. "Have you noticed birds gathering here?" The woman leaned on her broom. "Oh yes." "When?" "Almost every morning." Mena looked at Beck. The woman continued. "Little brown birds. They hop near the doorway. They peck at the ground. I always thought grain fell when baskets were carried." Beck thanked her kindly. The answer felt gentle. Not complete, but gentle. The three of them stood quietly watching several sparrows flutter between nearby roofs. The tiny birds seemed entirely uninterested in human worries. One landed upon the ground, found a seed hidden among the dust, and flew away again. Its wings disappeared into the bright afternoon sky. The village returned to its peaceful rhythm. A potter carried freshly shaped jars into the sunlight to dry. The baker removed another round of flat loaves from a clay oven. The rich smell drifted lazily through the streets, mixing with smoke from cooking fires and the sweet scent of crushed dates. Children slowly awoke from their afternoon rest. Their sleepy voices filled quiet courtyards. Some helped their mothers knead dough. Others followed older brothers toward the river carrying tiny fishing lines made from twisted plant fibers. The day continued without hurry. As evening slowly approached, the harsh brightness of the afternoon softened. Long shadows began stretching across the fields once again. Farmers gathered their tools. Oxen walked patiently home along familiar paths. The air cooled little by little. A breeze arrived from the Nile carrying the scent of fresh water and damp reeds. Mena found himself walking alone beside the river. This had become his favorite hour. The village behind him grew quieter. The busy sounds of work slowly gave way to softer evening voices. Families prepared supper. Oil lamps were lit inside homes one by one. Thin streams of smoke rose gently into the fading sky. The Nile reflected the warm colors of sunset without disturbing them. Its surface moved so smoothly that it almost seemed asleep. Mena sat upon a flat stone overlooking the water. He listened. A fisherman drew his boat onto the muddy bank. Wood rubbed softly against wet earth. Someone called quietly across the river. A pair of white birds lifted into the evening air before settling farther downstream. Everything felt peaceful. Yet the question remained. Only a little grain was missing. Perhaps the birds had taken some. Perhaps grain had spilled unnoticed beneath the doorway. Perhaps tired workers had measured carelessly after many long days beneath the harvest sun. Each answer seemed possible. None felt complete. Mena smiled faintly. Not because he had solved the mystery, because he realized that careful observation required patience more than certainty. The Nile had taught that lesson for generations. Its floods arrived in their own season. Its waters rose slowly. Its gifts appeared one quiet day at a time. Perhaps answers came the same way. Perhaps they should never be hurried. Behind him, the first evening lamps glowed warmly inside mud brick homes. Fresh bread rested upon woven mats. Simple bowls of lentils and onions waited beside clay cups filled with cool river water. Families gathered after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun, grateful for food, for rest, and for the quiet company of one another. As darkness slowly settled across the village, men arose from the stone and began the familiar walk home. The mystery of the missing grain remained as gentle as ever, carried softly through the evening like the whisper of the desert wind. And somewhere, hidden within the ordinary rhythms of harvest, work, and quiet village life, another small clue waited patiently for tomorrow's light. Night settled over the village with the quiet confidence of something that had happened every evening for countless generations. The last warm colors faded from the western sky, leaving behind deep shades of blue that slowly welcomed the first stars. The desert beyond the fields became little more than a gentle outline against the darkness, while the Nile reflected thin ribbons of moonlight across its calm surface. The day's heat did not disappear all at once. It slowly drifted away from the mud brick walls, from the stone paths, and from the wide fields that had rested beneath the bright Egyptian sun since morning. The air remained pleasantly warm, though now a soft breeze wandered through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of damp riverbanks, baked earth, and cooking fires that were beginning to grow quiet. Inside the village, families gathered for the evening meal. Simple wooden bowls were placed upon woven mats spread across smooth clay floors. Fresh bread, baked only hours before, still held a little warmth inside its crust. Lentils simmered with onions and herbs gathered from small garden plots beside the canals. Dates rested in shallow baskets, their sweetness waiting until the end of the meal. A few families enjoyed dried fish caught that morning from the Nile, while others shared goat cheese wrapped in clean linen. There was no hurry. The hardest work of the day had ended. Voices remained gentle. Children spoke more softly now, tired after hours spent running beside the river or helping their parents in the fields. Older people smiled as they listened, sometimes adding a quiet story from years long past, though never raising their voices enough to disturb the peaceful evening. In his own home, Mena sat cross-legged beside a low oil lamp. Its flame moved gently each time the breeze found its way through the doorway. His wife, Tia, folded fresh linen that had dried beneath the afternoon sun. Their young son had already fallen asleep upon a woven mat, one small hand resting beneath his cheek. His breathing was slow and even, untouched by thoughts of grain records or careful measurements. Tia noticed that Mena had become unusually quiet. "You are still thinking about the storehouse?" Mena smiled faintly. "A little." She poured water from a cool clay jar into a small cup and placed it beside him. "The grain." He nodded. "Only a little is missing." "Then perhaps only a little patience is needed." Her answer came so naturally that Mena laughed softly. "You sound wiser than the temple priests." "I simply bake bread. And somehow that teaches wisdom." She smiled without answering. Many people in the village believed that those who worked with grain every day learned lessons that could not easily be written upon papyrus. A baker understood waiting. Dough could not be hurried. An oven could not be forced to grow hotter before its fire was ready. Bread rose according to its own quiet rhythm. Perhaps mysteries did the same. The oil lamp burned steadily while insects sang outside in the darkness. Far across the river, another village glowed with a scattering of tiny lights. Between the two shores, the Nile continued its endless journey beneath the moon, carrying cool water through the sleeping land. When the meal had ended, Mena stepped outside. The street was peaceful. Neighbors sat upon low stools outside their homes, enjoying the cooler air before sleep. An old man slowly repaired a fishing net by lamplight. Two sisters twisted flax fibers into fine thread while speaking so quietly that their voices blended with the whispering wind. No one seemed troubled. The village trusted tomorrow. It always had. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise. Another walk to the fields. Another batch of bread. Another trip to the river. Another careful count inside the granary. Life continued because everyone quietly did their part. Mena wandered toward the edge of the village where the grain storehouses stood beneath the stars. He had no plan. He simply wished to look. The heavy wooden doors remained sealed. Moonlight rested across the mud brick walls, making every shadow appear softer than it had during the day. The storehouses seemed almost asleep. Nearby, dry reeds rustled gently. A small owl perched upon a wooden fence post, turning its head slowly before lifting into the night without making a sound. Mena stood listening. Silence has many voices. There was the faint movement of the river. The soft chirping of crickets. The distant splash of a fish breaking the surface of the Nile. The quiet breathing of the wind moving across empty fields. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed tiny movements near the base of the granary wall. Not one movement. Many. Small shapes darted briefly through the moonlight before disappearing again. Mena remained perfectly still. He did not step closer. He simply watched. After a few moments another small shadow appeared. It paused. Its tiny nose twitched. Then it hurried toward the doorway before vanishing beneath the wooden threshold. A mouse. Then another. Very small. Almost silent. Mena watched patiently. Several more appeared during the next few minutes. They never stayed in the open for long. Each one moved with remarkable speed before disappearing beneath nearby reeds or into small cracks between stacked baskets stored outside. Mena did not feel excitement. Only quiet understanding. Villages always had mice. Granaries always attracted them. Cats caught many. Owls caught others. Still, some remained. The question was not whether mice lived nearby. The question was whether they had found their way inside. He crouched beside the doorway. The narrow gap beneath the wood looked even smaller than it had during daylight. Could a mouse pass through? Perhaps. The opening was hardly wider than a finger. Yet mice were patient creatures. Patient enough to squeeze through spaces that seemed impossibly small. Mena smiled to himself. He had found another possibility. Not an answer. Only another quiet thought. He decided not to wake back. Morning would come soon enough. The village had waited through many harvests. It could wait through one more peaceful night. He turned toward home. Above him the stars stretched from one horizon to the other. Without the bright light of day, they seemed countless. Many Egyptians looked upon those stars with quiet wonder, believing that the heavens carried stories older than any living person could remember. Mena had often done the same as a child. His father would point toward familiar patterns while the evening breeze drifted across the river. Those stars watched my father. And his father before him. They will watch your son one day. The thought still comforted him. Some things changed. Children grew. Harvests came and went. New houses appeared while old ones slowly returned to earth. But the river, the stars, and the gentle turning of the seasons remained faithful companions. By the time Mena reached home, the village had grown even quieter. Most lamps had been extinguished. Only a few flickered behind small windows where someone finished weaving cloth or grinding grain for the morning meal. He lay down beside his sleeping family. The woven mat felt cool beneath him. Outside, the breeze slipped gently across the roof, carrying with it the scent of the Nile. Sleep came easily. Long before dawn, while nearly every family remained asleep, another part of the village quietly awakened. The bakers. Their work began while the stars still filled the sky. Clay ovens were cleaned of yesterday's ashes. Fresh straw crackled as new fires slowly came to life. The first pale smoke drifted upward into the cool darkness. Women measured flour into large mixing bowls. Water from the river was poured carefully into the waiting grain. Strong hands kneaded the dough with steady, practiced movements. The rhythm never changed. Press. Fold. Turn. Press again. Nearby, a young apprentice yawned as he carried baskets of flour from the storehouse reserved for the bakery. He moved carefully, trying not to spill even a handful. The master baker smiled kindly. No need to hurry. The bread has waited all night. It can wait another moment. The apprentice nodded, grateful for the gentle reminder. As the eastern sky slowly began to brighten once more, Mena awoke. The mystery of the missing grain had not followed him into his dreams. Instead, he had dreamed only of quiet water flowing through green fields. He rose before sunrise, washed his face with cool water from a clay basin, and stepped outside into the peaceful morning. The air felt fresh. Palm leaves whispered overhead. Birds welcomed another day. From somewhere nearby came the comforting smell of fresh bread already baking. Mena smiled. Whatever answers waited inside the granary, they would reveal themselves slowly. Like the river. Like the seasons. Like the first light of dawn spreading gently across the Nile. And with those calm thoughts accompanying him, he began another unhurried walk toward the storehouses, where the cool shadows of morning still rested against the ancient mud brick walls, and where the quiet mystery of the missing grain continued to wait with the same patient silence as the land itself. Before the sun rose above the eastern horizon, the village belonged to quiet footsteps and gentle voices. The stars still lingered overhead, though they had begun to fade one by one as a pale silver light spread slowly across the sky. The Nile reflected that soft light like polished stone, its surface disturbed only by the lazy circles made by fish rising briefly before disappearing again into the cool water. The morning breeze carried the scent of damp earth from the riverbanks. It slipped through the rows of date palms and over the sleeping fields before winding gently between the mud brick homes. Loose strands of straw stirred outside doorways. Linen cloth hanging from wooden poles moved almost silently. This was Mena's favorite hour. The village had not yet become busy. There were no carts creaking along dusty roads. No voices calling across the fields. No steady ringing of bronze tools against stone. Only the quiet beginning of another ordinary day. He walked slowly toward the granary, his sandals making soft sounds against the packed earth. The storehouses stood exactly as they had the evening before, their thick walls touched by the cool blue light that comes only just before dawn. The heavy wooden doors remained closed. The clay seal placed across the latch was still unbroken. Mena examined it carefully. Nothing had disturbed it during the night. He rested his fingers lightly against the wood. The door still felt cool from the darkness. For a few moments he simply stood listening. The village seemed to breathe slowly around him. From somewhere across the river came the faint call of a water bird greeting the morning. Farther away, a donkey gave one sleepy bray before becoming quiet again. The world seemed content to awaken gently. Soon Beck appeared, carrying a small clay lamp whose flame was growing less necessary as daylight slowly returned. "You arrived early," Beck said with a smile. "I wanted to see the storehouse before the workers came." Beck nodded. "So did I." Without another word they broke the clay seal together. The wooden bar was lifted. The great door opened with its familiar, gentle groan. Cool air drifted outward. Inside, the granary remained peaceful. Rows of baskets waited in neat order beneath the dim morning light. Dust floated lazily through the narrow beams entering from the high vents. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Mena's eyes moved immediately toward the floor near the doorway. He knelt. There, resting upon the smooth clay surface, lay several fresh grains of barley. Only a few. Scattered almost carelessly. Beck crouched beside him. "They were not here yesterday." "No." Mena followed them with his eyes. Again they formed the faintest trail toward the narrow space beneath the wooden door. He reached into a nearby basket. The grain inside felt dry and clean. Beck looked around the room before quietly saying, "Let us not guess." Mena agreed. Patience remained their most useful tool. The two men walked slowly around the inside walls of the granary. The walls themselves were strong. Years of careful repair had kept them smooth and solid. There were no large cracks. No broken bricks. Only tiny places where time had gently worn the mud plaster. Near one corner, where several older baskets had been placed together, Mena noticed something else. The floor held a little more dust than the rest of the room. Not much. Only enough to soften the surface. He leaned closer. Very small marks crossed the dust. They were almost invisible. Tiny prints. 4 little feet. Another set beside them. Then another. Beck smiled quietly. "It seems our visitors enjoy this corner." Mena nodded. "Mice." "Most likely." Neither man sounded disappointed. Neither sounded relieved. They had simply discovered another small piece of the story. The marks continued toward the rear wall, disappearing behind several large woven grain bins that had not been moved since the harvest. Beck looked thoughtfully at the stacked baskets. "It has been some time since we cleaned behind these." "It has." Together they began lifting the smaller baskets first. Each one was heavy, filled with grain collected from different families across the village. They moved slowly, careful not to strain their backs. The room filled with the soft rustling sound of barley shifting inside woven reeds. Dust rose gently into the cool air. As more space opened behind the baskets, sunlight reached places that had remained shaded for many weeks. There was no hidden tunnel. No broken wall. No secret opening. Only dry earth. Old straw. A few scattered husks. And more tiny footprints. Mena smiled. "They have been busy." Beck chuckled. "So it seems." Near the base of the wall lay several empty date pits. Someone had likely dropped them while cleaning after the harvest. The mice had clearly appreciated the forgotten meal. Life in the village rarely wasted anything. Even the smallest scraps eventually found a purpose. Outside, the village had begun to wake. The sound of grinding stones drifted through the open doorway. Women prepared flour for the morning bread, pushing one stone slowly over another in a rhythm that had remained unchanged for centuries. Children fetched water from the Nile with clay jars balanced carefully against their shoulders. The smell of fresh bread floated through the cool morning air. Nearby, a fisherman untangled his nets while sitting upon a smooth river stone. His fingers moved almost without thought. Years of practice had taught them every knot, every repair, every weak place that needed careful attention. He hummed quietly to himself while a small white heron waited nearby, hoping that an overlooked fish might become breakfast. The village carried on exactly as it always had. Its people did not know that two men inside the granary were following the tiny footprints of creatures hardly larger than a child's hand. By the time the sun finally appeared above the eastern fields, warm light had begun filling the storehouse. The mice had left signs in several places. Little trails in the dust. Tiny bits of straw gathered into corners. One or two barley husks carried beneath stacked baskets. Nothing suggested that large amounts of grain had disappeared. Certainly not enough to explain every difference in the records. Beck stood quietly with his hands resting on his hips. It may be several small things. Mena looked toward the nearest basket. A few careless measurements. A little spilled grain. A few hungry birds. And hungry mice. Beck nodded. Together they become noticeable. The thought pleased Mena. Not because it solved the mystery completely, but because ordinary life often worked that way. Many small moments became one large season. Many tiny drops filled the canals. Many handfuls of grain became a village's harvest. Perhaps many little losses, each too small to notice alone, had quietly gathered until they finally appeared inside the careful records. The workers soon arrived. They greeted Beck and Mena warmly before beginning another day's duties. Some swept the floors. Others inspected the baskets. Young boys carried empty sacks toward waiting carts. An older woman carefully brushed every corner with a reed broom, smiling when she discovered the tiny mouse tracks. They visit every harvest, she said. They always think the grain belongs to them. Beck laughed softly. And perhaps they believe they planted it? The woman laughed as well. My cat disagrees. Just then, as though hearing its own importance mentioned, a lean gray cat wandered through the doorway. Its ears stood alert. Its tail moved slowly from side to side. Without paying the slightest attention to the people around it, the cat sniffed the air and calmly walked toward the rear corner where the tiny footprints had disappeared. Everyone watched quietly. The cat paused, sat down, and waited. Perfectly still. Mena smiled. No one had taught the cat about missing grain. No one had explained the careful records. Yet it understood its own work as naturally as the fishermen understood the river and the farmers understood the soil. The village itself seemed to know how to care for its own balance. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher. Warmth spread across the rooftops. Palm leaves shimmered softly in the breeze. The scent of fresh bread had given way to the smell of sun-warmed earth and drying reeds. Mena closed his writing tablet after making several careful notes. He no longer felt that quiet uncertainty he had carried over the past 2 days. Instead, he felt something gentler. Curiosity. There were still questions. There would always be questions. But the mystery no longer felt hidden in darkness. It was revealing itself little by little, just as dawn revealed the river each morning, not all at once, but softly, patiently, and without hurry. He stepped outside and looked across the fields where farmers had already begun another day's work. From this distance they appeared as small figures moving steadily through the green and gold, following the same paths their parents and grandparents had walked before them. The Nile flowed beside them, calm as ever. The wind carried the sound of reeds brushing together. Somewhere nearby, the village cat remained perfectly still beside the granary wall, watching a tiny opening with endless patience. And Mena found himself thinking that perhaps the land held many mysteries, but it never seemed eager to hide them forever. It simply asked those who lived upon it to slow their steps, open their eyes, and allow time to become their quiet companion. The sun continued its slow climb across the white Egyptian sky, filling the village with a warm golden light that settled gently over every rooftop, every field, and every quiet corner beside the Nile. Morning had fully arrived now, yet the day still felt peaceful. The busiest hours of labor had begun, but no one hurried. The people of the village had learned long ago that rushing beneath the desert sun only invited greater exhaustion. Mena remained outside the granary for a little while, watching the workers begin their familiar routines. A young man carefully swept the entrance with a broom made from bundled palm fibers. He moved the dust toward the roadside where the morning breeze would soon carry it away. Every few moments he paused to wipe his forehead with a corner of his linen cloth, though the day had only just begun. Nearby, two brothers lifted grain baskets onto a wooden sled that would be pulled by a patient ox toward the village bakery. The baskets were heavy, and they worked together without speaking very much. One lifted while the other steadied. They had done this so many times that words were hardly needed. The ox waited quietly. Its ears flicked at passing flies. When the load was ready, it leaned forward with slow strength, and the sled began to slide across the packed earth with a soft scraping sound. Mena watched until they disappeared between the mud brick homes. Even such an ordinary task carried its own quiet beauty. Every basket represented many mornings spent in the fields. Every measure of grain held countless hours of bending beneath the sun, guiding water through canals, pulling weeds, cutting stalks, and carrying bundles home before darkness settled over the land. No loaf of bread ever began inside the oven. It always began months earlier beside the Nile. Beck stepped beside him. The bakery will be busy today. They always are after market day. Beck nodded. Travelers came yesterday. They carried grain away, and brought pottery in return. The exchange reminded Mena how connected every village was to the next. Small boats drifted along the Nile carrying more than goods. They carried stories, news, songs, seeds, ideas. One fisherman might leave his village before sunrise and return home after sunset, having spoken with people from places many days away. Yet the river never seemed crowded. There was always enough room for another quiet boat. The two men began walking toward the bakery. The narrow street curved gently between rows of simple homes whose walls had been coated with fresh mud plaster after the last flood season. Children played quietly beneath shaded doorways while older sisters twisted flax into thread. The smell of baking bread grew stronger with every step. It was one of the village's most comforting scents. Warm, nutty, slightly sweet. It drifted through the streets long before anyone saw the ovens themselves. The bakery stood beneath a wide shelter made from wooden poles and woven reeds that softened the fierce sunlight. Several clay ovens glowed with gentle heat, their rounded walls darkened by many years of steady use. Inside, the work flowed with calm purpose. Women kneaded dough upon smooth wooden tables dusted with flour. A young apprentice carried fresh water from a nearby jar. Another carefully stacked finished loaves into woven baskets lined with clean cloth. The master baker greeted Beck and Mena with flour covering both hands. "You have come just in time. For bread. For breakfast." He smiled warmly. Fresh loaves were placed before them while still warm from the oven. The crust crackled softly as the bread cooled. Beck tore away a small piece. So simple. And always welcome. The baker laughed. That is the best kind of meal. Mena tasted the warm bread slowly. It carried the rich flavor of freshly ground barley mixed with wheat. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest crumbs were gathered afterward. While they ate, Mena watched one young woman measuring flour into a large mixing bowl. She filled the measuring basket carefully. Then leveled the top with a smooth piece of wood before pouring it into the bowl. Every measure looked almost identical. The movement caught his attention. When she noticed him watching, she smiled politely. My father says uneven measures make uneven bread. Mena smiled back. He is wise. She shrugged gently. He is a baker. The answer pleased him. Throughout the village, every craft carried its own quiet wisdom. Potters learned patience from drying clay. Boat builders learned balance from the river. Weavers learned rhythm from moving threads. Farmers learned hope from every season. Bakers learned precision from grain. Perhaps that was why the missing grain continued to rest in Mena's thoughts. Not because of its value alone, but because careful work deserved careful attention. As the morning continued, more villagers arrived at the bakery. A fisherman traded several fresh fish for bread. An elderly widow received her daily loaf prepared from grain stored for those who could no longer work the fields. Children waited patiently while warm flatbreads cooled enough to carry home without burning their hands. The bakery felt less like a place of business and more like the gentle heart of the village. Everyone eventually passed through its doorway. Everyone depended upon it. Outside, market stalls slowly opened along the wider road leading toward the river. Merchants spread woven mats across the ground before arranging simple goods upon them. Clay jars, copper needles, bundles of onions, garlic, fresh herbs, small carved wooden toys, linen cloth folded into neat stacks. Nothing was displayed with great excitement. There was no shouting, no loud bargaining. People greeted one another warmly before discussing prices in calm voices. A little farther along, fishermen rested beside baskets filled with the morning's catch. Silver fish glistened in the sunlight while flies buzzed lazily above them. Cats wandered nearby with hopeful eyes. One old fisherman noticed Mena approaching. You look thoughtful. I often do. The fisherman laughed. My wife says that is the trouble with scribes. And what is the trouble? You count everything. Mena laughed softly. Sometimes. The old man pointed toward the river. I count only the fish I catch. And even then, only after they stop jumping. The two men shared a quiet smile before the fisherman returned to cleaning his nets. The conversation lingered pleasantly in Mena's thoughts. Perhaps every person counted different things. Farmers counted seasons. Children counted birthdays only by remembering floods. Masons counted stones. Sailors counted stars. Scribes counted grain. No count was perfect. Life itself refused perfect numbers. By midday, the heat became stronger. Workers sought whatever shade they could find. Some rested beneath palm trees. Others sat beside cool mud brick walls where the thick clay held the night's remaining coolness. The village seemed to slow its breathing. Even the birds became quieter. Mena returned once more to the granary. The gray cat still waited near the back corner. It had hardly moved. Only its ears turned slightly toward the faintest sounds. Then, without warning, it sprang. There was barely a whisper. A tiny rustle. Another moment of silence. When the cat settled once more, a small mouse hung gently from its mouth. The workers nearby smiled. One elderly man nodded with satisfaction. "Our newest guard has earned today's rest." The cat disappeared beneath the shade of a nearby cart, carrying its prize. Mena watched the place where the mouse had appeared. The tiny opening between two stacked baskets seemed almost invisible. He walked over and carefully moved the baskets aside. Behind them lay a narrow space where bits of straw, dry reeds, and a few scattered kernels of barley had gathered over many weeks. Nothing dramatic. Nothing surprising. Simply a quiet corner that no one had disturbed since the harvest. Beck joined him. "It seems we have neglected this place. For a little while. We shall clean it and move the baskets more often." Beck nodded. "Small habits prevent larger problems." Mena wrote those words upon his tablet, not as an official record, but as a reminder to himself. The village had taught him many lessons over the years. This seemed another worth remembering. The missing grain had never belonged to one single mystery. It belonged to many small moments. A little spilled while baskets were carried. A few kernels dropped beneath the doorway. Birds found breakfast in the dust. Mice gathered tiny treasures during the night. Measurements varied slightly after long days of tiring work. None of these alone explained very much. Together they quietly told the story. As the afternoon breeze drifted once more from the Nile, carrying the cool scent of river water into the warm village streets, Mena closed his writing tablet with a peaceful heart. The mystery was not yet completely finished. There were still records to compare and storehouses to inspect. But the answers were arriving gently, just as the river nourished the land not with sudden force, but with patient generosity, one small gift at a time. And beneath the endless Egyptian sky, where farmers continued their steady work and the ovens filled the air with the comforting smell of fresh bread, the quiet life of the village flowed onward with the same calm rhythm that had carried it through countless harvests before. The afternoon passed with the slow, unhurried rhythm that seemed to belong only to the lands beside the Nile. The bright sun rested high above the village, pouring warm light across the fields until every stone, every reed, and every mud brick wall held a quiet glow. The heat wrapped itself around the people like a heavy linen blanket. No one complained. They simply adjusted their pace, as they always had, allowing the day to unfold without haste. Beyond the village, the fields stretched toward the river in careful rows. Water moved gently through the irrigation canals, flowing around smooth bends that had been shaped and repaired by many generations of careful hands. The sound of moving water was never loud. It whispered softly against the dark earth, feeding the barley, the wheat, the onions, and the small gardens where herbs grew beneath the shade of date palms. A farmer named Hapus stood ankle-deep in one of the canals, guiding the water with a flat wooden shovel. He was no longer young. His beard had become touched with gray, and the lines around his eyes had deepened after many years beneath the Egyptian sun. Still, his movements remained steady. He knew every turn of the water. A small ridge of earth could change the flow completely. Just one careful push with the shovel could send the river's gift toward a thirsty field instead of allowing it to drift away. His grandson watched from the bank. The boy could not have seen more than 8 floods of the Nile. His sandals were slightly too large, and his linen tunic reached almost to his ankles. He watched his grandfather's hands with quiet attention. Finally he asked, "How do you know where the water wants to go?" Hapus smiled without looking up. "The water tells me." The boy looked puzzled. "It speaks. In its own way." He rested the shovel for a moment. "If you hurry, you cannot hear it." The child looked toward the canal. The water continued moving peacefully around a bend. It seemed impossible that it could speak. Yet he remained silent, listening. After a while Hapu gently moved another small ridge of earth. The water immediately changed direction, spreading slowly across a patch of dry soil. "There," he said softly. It was waiting. The boy smiled. Perhaps he had begun to understand. Not every lesson came through words. Some were learned simply by watching. Mena often believed the same about writing. The symbols upon his tablets were important. But they only held meaning because they described the quiet work of ordinary people. Without the farmers, the fishermen, the potters, the bakers, and the builders, the records would become nothing more than empty marks. As the afternoon drifted onward, Mena left the granary and wandered toward the river. He had finished his work for the day, though his thoughts still lingered upon the small mystery that had quietly occupied his mind. He no longer felt concerned. Instead, he found himself noticing all the little ways that grain traveled through the village. A child carried a small sack of flour home from the bakery. A woman brushed a handful of barley from her apron after grinding it into flour. 2 ducks pecked happily at a few scattered kernels beside a cart. Even the breeze lifted tiny pieces of dry straw across the road. The grain seemed almost alive. Not because it moved on its own, but because every person, every animal, and every season carried it gently from one place to another. Nothing remained completely still for long. At the riverbank, fishermen were preparing their boats for the evening. The hottest hours had passed. Soon the light would soften, and the fish would become easier to catch. One old fisherman rubbed oil along the wooden paddle that had belonged to his father. The smooth handle had grown dark after many years of use. His hands followed familiar places worn by countless journeys across the Nile. Nearby, another fisherman mended a small tier in a papyrus boat. He worked patiently, weaving fresh reeds into the old ones until the repair became almost invisible. Mena greeted them both. "Will the river be kind tonight?" The older fisherman looked toward the quiet water. "The river is always itself." "I suppose it is. We are the ones who change." Mena considered those words. They settled gently in his thoughts. The Nile did not hurry when people hurried. It did not become anxious when harvests were uncertain. It simply continued flowing. Perhaps that was why life beside the river encouraged patience. Every important thing required waiting. Seeds. Floods. Bread. Children. Even understanding. A small boat drifted away from the shore. 2 brothers sat inside, pushing their paddles through the water with slow, even strokes. The ripples spread quietly behind them before fading once more into stillness. White egrets stood among the reeds watching for fish. Dragonflies schemed across the surface, their wings shining briefly whenever they caught the afternoon sun. The air smelled of wet mud, river grass, and warm reeds drying along the bank. Mena sat beneath an acacia tree. Its shade offered welcome relief. He closed his eyes for a moment and simply listened. There was the gentle splash of paddles. The whisper of reeds brushing together. The distant call of a heron. A soft breeze moving through palm leaves. The quiet voices of women washing linen farther downstream. The world seemed full of peaceful sounds. None competed with another. Each found its own place. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed an elderly woman walking carefully along the riverbank with 2 empty baskets. She moved slowly, though not because she was weak. She simply understood that the baskets would soon become heavy. She stopped beside the water, rinsed each basket carefully, and then turned them upside down to dry in the warm breeze. Mena recognized her. Her name was Henad, She had once worked in the granary many years before. He walked over and greeted her. "It has been some time." She smiled warmly. "You still carry your writing tablet. And you still carry baskets." She laughed softly. "They are lighter than your records." The two shared a quiet moment watching the river. After a while Mena asked, "When you worked at the granary, did you ever lose grain?" Henut looked toward the baskets drying beside the water. "Every day." Mena raised an eyebrow. "Every day. A few kernels here. A few there. Some fell while lifting. Some while pouring. Some when the wind became playful." She smiled gently. The trick was not to lose much. Her answer pleased Mena. It matched everything he had slowly begun to discover. Life was filled with tiny losses. A little flour remained inside the grinding stones. A little water soaked into the earth before reaching the fields. A little oil stayed inside the clay jar after it seemed empty. No careful person expected perfection. Only attention. Henut picked up one of the baskets. "My father always said something." "What was that?" She looked toward the fields glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "If the birds eat a little. If the mice eat a little. If your neighbors eat well. Then the harvest has done its work." Mena smiled. The words carried remarkable kindness. Grain existed to nourish life. Not merely to fill storage baskets. As the sun slowly began its journey toward the western desert, long shadows stretched once again across the village. The harsh brightness softened into warm gold. Children returned from the river carrying bundles of reeds. Goats wandered lazily through the streets. Smoke rose from the first evening cooking fires. The scent of baking bread returned once more. Every evening the village seemed to exhale. The hardest labor had ended. Voices became quieter. Footsteps slower. The whole community settled gently toward another peaceful night. Mena stood for a long while watching the sunlight dance across the calm surface of the Nile. The mystery of the missing grain had begun with a few unexpected numbers upon a writing tablet. Now it had become something larger, though far gentler than he had imagined. It had become a reminder that a village was held together not by perfect records alone, but by thousands of small acts of care. By the baker who measured flour with patient hands. By the farmer who guided water one careful channel at a time. By the fisherman who repaired his net before it failed. By the sweeper who kept the granary clean. By the quiet gray cat who watched the shadows without complaint. By every ordinary person whose steady work, repeated day after day beneath the warm Egyptian sun, allowed life beside the Nile to continue as peacefully as the river itself. And as evening settled softly over the ancient land once more, Mena began the familiar walk home through streets glowing with the gentle light of oil lamps, knowing that tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another count of grain, and countless more quiet moments waiting to be noticed by those patient enough to see them. The evening breeze wandered gently through the village, carrying away the last warmth of the day. The sun had slipped behind the western desert, leaving the sky painted with soft shades of amber that slowly deepened into violet. One by one, the stars appeared above the Nile, just as they had every night for generations beyond memory. The village settled into its familiar rhythm of rest. Cooking fires glowed inside small courtyards. Oil lamps flickered behind open doorways. The smell of warm bread lingered in the air, joined now by the gentle scent of onions, lentils, roasted fish, and fresh herbs gathered that morning from gardens beside the canals. Children finished their evening meals. Some leaned sleepily against their parents. Others listened while grandparents shared quiet stories about years when the Nile had risen especially high or when the harvest had filled every storehouse until there was scarcely room for another basket. The stories were never hurried. They unfolded slowly, like the river itself. Mena reached his home just as Tia was placing fresh bread upon a woven mat. The small oil lamp beside the meal gave the room a warm golden glow. Their son looked up eagerly. "Did you find the missing grain?" Mena smiled as he sat beside him. "I found a little more of its story." The boy tilted his head. "It has a story. Everything has a story. The grain. Yes. The river. Yes. The cat." Mena laughed quietly. "Especially the cat." The boy smiled, satisfied with the answer, though he did not fully understand it. He tore a small piece of bread and dipped it into a bowl of lentils before taking a thoughtful bite. Children often accepted mysteries more easily than adults. They did not always need every answer. Sometimes they were content simply knowing that tomorrow would bring another chance to ask. After the meal, Tia gathered the empty bowls while Mena stepped onto the flat roof of their home. Many families spent part of the evening there. The rooftops caught the cooling breeze that drifted from the Nile after sunset. Across the village, neighbors sat quietly beneath the stars. Some mended sandals by lamplight. Others repaired fishing nets. A mother gently combed her daughter's long dark hair while humming a melody that had likely been sung in her own childhood. The sounds floated softly through the night. No voice rose above the others. Everything seemed to belong together. Mena looked toward the granary in the distance. From where he stood, it appeared only as a quiet outline against the starlit sky. Its thick walls had guarded harvests through many seasons. They had witnessed years of abundance and years when every handful of grain had been carefully measured. The storehouse itself asked for nothing. It simply waited. Patiently. As all good storehouses did. Far beyond the village, the desert stretched beneath the moonlight. The dunes appeared almost silver now. During the day they reflected fierce sunlight. At night they became gentle. The wind traced delicate patterns across their surface, smoothing away footprints that had been left only hours before. The desert never hurried to erase them. It simply continued its quiet work. Mena often thought that time behaved much the same way. Every day left small marks. A child grew taller. A wall needed fresh plaster. A basket became worn. A favorite sandal grew thinner at the heel. Nothing changed all at once. Everything changed little by little. The mystery of the missing grain had reminded him of that. A few kernels scattered here. A handful there. A tiny measure carried away by birds. Another discovered by mice. A little lost while pouring grain into baskets. Small things were easy to overlook. Yet they gently shaped the larger story. The night grew deeper. Most of the village had gone to sleep. Only a few lamps still glowed. The baker had already begun preparing tomorrow's fire. Even now, before midnight, dry bundles of straw had been stacked neatly beside the clay ovens. Morning always arrived sooner than expected for those who baked bread. Across the river, a fisherman rested inside his small papyrus boat. He had chosen to spend the night upon the water. The gentle rocking helped him sleep. His net lay folded beside him. His paddle rested across the boat. Above him the stars reflected softly in the still river until it became difficult to tell where the sky ended and the water began. Not far away, another quiet watcher had begun its work. The gray cat from the granary slipped silently through the moonlit streets. Its paws made almost no sound upon the packed earth. It paused beside a stack of empty baskets. Its ears turned. Its whiskers twitched. Somewhere beneath the baskets came the faintest rustle. The cat waited. Patience belonged to hunters. The moon climbed higher. The village remained still. After several long moments, a tiny mouse appeared. It hesitated only briefly before hurrying across the open ground. The cat moved like flowing water. Swift. Silent. Then everything became quiet once again. The balance of the village continued. No celebration. No excitement. Simply another ordinary moment in the life of a place where every creature played its own small part. Long before dawn, the air cooled enough that dew gathered lightly upon the reeds beside the Nile. The stars remained bright overhead. Mena awoke before the first bird called. For a moment he remained still, listening. The house was peaceful. Tia and their son still slept soundly. Outside, the village rested beneath the last quiet hour of darkness. He enjoyed this moment more than any other. It belonged neither to yesterday nor fully to today. It was simply a gentle pause between 2 days. He dressed quietly and stepped outside. The cool air touched his face. Above him the familiar stars slowly began fading as the eastern horizon grew pale. The baker's fire already glowed faintly in the distance. A fisherman walked toward the river carrying his neatly folded net across one shoulder. An old woman swept her doorway with slow, careful strokes. No one spoke. Words seemed unnecessary before sunrise. Mena walked once more toward the granary. Not because he expected another surprise. Not because he believed another mystery waited inside. He walked because it was part of the village's rhythm. The path itself had become familiar beneath his feet. He knew every bend. Every smooth stone. Every date palm whose shadow crossed the road each morning. When he reached the granary, he paused beside the doorway. The clay seal remained untouched since the previous evening. The breeze carried the scent of fresh bread beginning to bake. Nearby, the gray cat sat upon a low wall, calmly washing one paw before smoothing its whiskers. Mena smiled. "You have been busy." The cat blinked once. If it understood praise, it gave no sign. It simply continued its careful morning washing, perfectly content beneath the fading stars. Beck soon arrived carrying his writing tablet beneath one arm. He greeted Mena with a quiet nod. Another peaceful morning. The best kind. Together they opened the heavy wooden doors. The cool air welcomed them once again. Inside, the baskets rested exactly where they had been carefully arranged the day before. The floor had been swept clean. The dark corner behind the stacked bins was now open, allowing light and fresh air to reach places that had remained hidden for many weeks. Mena looked around the room. Everything felt lighter. Not because the mystery had completely disappeared, but because attention had returned. Sometimes that was enough. A place that was carefully watched often remained well cared for. He opened his writing tablet. The familiar symbols waited patiently for another day's records. Outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the palm trees, and a chorus of birds welcomed the new day. The Nile shimmered with fresh light, its calm waters flowing steadily past fields that would soon fill with workers once again. The village stirred gently awake, wrapped in the comforting rhythm of another ordinary morning, while inside the quiet granary, Mena dipped his reed brush into fresh ink, ready to continue the simple, careful work that connected one peaceful day to the next. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the Nile, touching the quiet water with soft bands of gold. Mist rose gently from the river where the coolness of the night met the warmth of the coming day. The reeds along the banks swayed almost lazily, their slender leaves whispering together whenever the morning breeze wandered through them. Inside the granary, the world still belonged to silence. Mena sat upon a low wooden stool near the entrance. Before him rested his writing tablet, a small jar of black ink, and several neatly trimmed reed brushes. He preferred to begin each morning in the same careful way. Familiar routines gave peace to the mind, just as familiar paths gave comfort to tired feet. Beck walked slowly between the rows of grain baskets. The changes they had made the previous day were already easy to notice. The baskets had been spaced a little farther apart. The dark corner at the back of the room had been swept clean. Fresh straw had been laid beneath the larger storage bins, making it easier to notice if grain should fall again. None of these changes seemed important by themselves. Yet together they made the room feel brighter, more open, more welcoming. Mena carefully wrote the date according to the season of the flood. The symbols flowed smoothly beneath his hand. Outside, voices gradually began to fill the village. A rooster crowed from somewhere beyond the bakery. A pair of donkeys answered with slow, sleepy calls. Children hurried toward the river carrying empty clay jars almost as large as themselves. The familiar sounds drifted through the open doorway without disturbing the calm inside the granary. Soon the first workers arrived. An elderly porter named Nebu entered carrying a wide woven basket balanced easily upon one shoulder. His face was deeply lined from many years beneath the sun, yet his eyes remained bright and gentle. He had worked around grain for longer than many of the younger laborers had been alive. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Good morning," Mena replied. Nebu carefully lowered the basket onto the floor. He did not drop it. He did not hurry. He bent his knees, steadied the weight with both hands, and placed it down so gently that scarcely a single kernel escaped. Mena watched with quiet admiration. "You have carried grain for many years." Nebu smiled. "My father taught me." "And who taught him?" "My grandfather." The old porter rested his hands upon the empty basket. "He always said the grain remembers rough hands." Mena looked up. "The grain remembers." Nebu laughed softly. "Perhaps not. But the people certainly do." The words lingered pleasantly in the cool morning air. Respect for simple work passed from one generation to the next, not through grand speeches, but through small habits repeated every day. Carry carefully. Measure honestly. Sweep thoroughly. Share fairly. These lessons were rarely written. They lived inside ordinary people. As the morning continued, carts arrived one after another. Some carried grain meant for the bakery. Others delivered barley promised to workers repairing an irrigation canal several villages to the south. Each basket was counted. Each measure was recorded. The process unfolded with quiet precision. No one raised their voice. No one rushed another. Outside, the bakery had become wonderfully busy. Warm loaves were stacked in tall woven baskets lined with clean linen. The smell drifted through nearly every street in the village. Children smiled whenever the scent reached them. Even before breakfast, it promised comfort. A young apprentice named Didu carefully carried a basket of fresh bread toward the granary. The loaves were still warm enough that thin curls of steam escaped into the morning air. He paused beside Mena. "My master sent these." "For the workers?" "Yes." Mena thanked him. The young apprentice placed the basket upon a shaded table before hurrying back toward the ovens. His sandals left faint marks in the dust that would disappear before midday. The workers gathered briefly for a simple meal. Each person received a loaf of bread, a few dates, and cool water drawn from large clay jars. No one ate quickly. After hours of lifting baskets or guiding oxen through the fields, people learned to appreciate quiet moments of rest. Nebu sat beneath the shade of a date palm. He broke his bread slowly. Small crumbs fell upon the ground. Almost immediately, a tiny sparrow hopped closer. Then another. Soon 4 little birds gathered around his feet. The old porter smiled. They know my meal better than I do. Beck happened to overhear him. They have excellent memory. They certainly do. Nebu tore away another tiny piece and placed it gently upon the earth. The sparrows waited only a heartbeat before claiming it. Mena watched from the doorway. Once again he thought about grain. Not only inside baskets. Not only inside records. Grain fed every corner of village life. People. Birds. Oxen. Even the mice that had quietly visited the granary. Nothing truly existed alone. The smallest kernel often traveled farther than anyone expected. By late morning, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the tops of the storehouse walls. Inside, however, the thick mud bricks still held the coolness gathered during the night. Beck paused beside one of the larger baskets. This room breathes well. It does. The walls have served many harvests. Mena placed his hand upon the smooth plaster. He could almost imagine the builders who had shaped these walls years earlier. They had mixed mud with chopped straw, pressed each brick into wooden molds, laid them one upon another beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Perhaps those builders had never imagined that generations later another scribe would quietly admire their careful work. Yet their labor remained. Invisible in one way. Enduring in another. Around midday, a potter arrived carrying several newly fired storage jars. The old jars used for measuring grain had begun showing tiny cracks after many seasons. Fresh ones would replace them little by little. The potter carefully arranged the new vessels beside the doorway. Their smooth surfaces shone softly beneath the sunlight. Mena picked one up. It felt cool despite the growing heat outside. You made these well. The potter smiled modestly. The clay was good. The river deserves some praise. It usually does. Both men laughed gently. In the village, people rarely claimed full credit for their work. The farmer thanked the flood. The potter thanked the clay. The fisherman thanked the river. The baker thanked the grain. Everyone understood that life depended upon many quiet gifts beyond their own hands. As the afternoon approached, the pace of work slowed. The heat settled heavily across the land. Workers sought shade whenever possible. Some rested against cool walls. Others sat beneath woven shelters drinking water from clay cups. The gray cat wandered lazily into the granary. It looked around with calm yellow eyes before choosing a comfortable place beside the newly cleaned corner. There it curled into a tight circle. Within moments it was asleep. Its steady breathing almost matched the peaceful rhythm of the room itself. Mena smiled. It approves. Beck looked toward the sleeping cat. I believe it does. Outside, palm leaves whispered softly overhead. The Nile continued its endless journey beyond the fields. Somewhere a fisherman sang quietly while repairing his net. A child laughed. An old woman swept her doorway. A baker removed another round of warm bread from the oven. Nothing remarkable happened. Nothing needed to. The village found its greatest comfort in ordinary days that unfolded gently from sunrise to sunset. Mena dipped his reed brush into fresh ink once more and completed the morning's final record. The numbers rested neatly upon the tablet. Today they matched the grain. He looked at them for a long moment, not with pride, but with quiet gratitude. Sometimes the smallest mysteries reminded people to pay closer attention, to clean forgotten corners, to move heavy baskets, to watch the birds, to appreciate the patient work of a gray cat, to notice the many tiny moments that quietly held a village together. Outside, the breeze carried the comforting scent of fresh bread and river water through the open doorway, and the peaceful life of ancient Egypt continued beneath the warm afternoon sun, just as it had for countless seasons, one careful day flowing gently into the next like the calm and faithful waters of the Nile. The afternoon sunlight rested gently upon the village, turning the mud brick walls a warm shade of honey. The streets had become quieter again as many people paused during the hottest hours of the day. Even the animals sought shade. Goats gathered beneath date palms, donkeys stood beside cool walls with half-closed eyes, and birds settled among the reeds where the breeze from the Nile felt a little fresher. Inside the granary, the air remained pleasantly cool. The thick walls had absorbed the night's chill and released it slowly throughout the day. It was one reason grain could be stored safely through the changing seasons. The builders who had raised these walls many years before understood the land well. They knew where the morning sun would fall and where the afternoon shade would linger longest. Mena closed his writing tablet for a while. The morning's work had been completed. The grain had been counted. The baskets inspected. The floor swept until only the faintest traces of dust remained. There was nothing urgent waiting for him. That alone felt like a quiet blessing. He stepped outside into the warmth. The village shimmered gently beneath the afternoon sun. A narrow path led toward the canals, where several farmers were resting beneath a shelter made from bundled reeds. Their wooden tools lay beside them, neatly arranged rather than scattered. Even during rest, there was a quiet order to everything they did. Mena wandered toward them. One of the farmers lifted a clay cup in greeting. "Come out of the cool storehouse for a while. I thought I should remember what the sun feels like." The men laughed softly. There were 5 of them, each from a different family, though they had worked beside one another for many years. Their friendship had grown as steadily as the crops they tended. One man slowly peeled an onion with weathered hands. Another broke pieces from a round loaf of barley bread and passed them around without a word. No one counted the pieces. No one wondered whether they were receiving exactly the same amount. They simply shared. The bread disappeared little by little until only a few crumbs rested upon the woven mat. A tiny brown bird landed nearby. It watched quietly. One of the farmers smiled and brushed the crumbs toward it with his fingertips. "There," he whispered. "You have worked hard watching us all morning." The others smiled. No one minded giving away such a small gift. Mena remembered Henut's words beside the river. "If the birds eat a little, if the mice eat a little, if your neighbors eat well, then the harvest has done its work." The sentence returned to him as gently as the afternoon breeze. It seemed even wiser now. After resting for a while, the farmers rose together. Without discussion, each man picked up the same tool he had been using before the meal. The rhythm of work returned as naturally as breathing. One cleaned a canal. Another checked the young barley. A third repaired a small bank where water had begun wearing away the earth. No one hurried to finish before the sun moved. The land would still be there tomorrow. The Nile would still be flowing. Good work required steady hands, not fast ones. Mena continued walking until he reached the edge of the fields. From there he could see nearly the entire village. The bakery stood near the center, its clay ovens sending thin ribbons of smoke into the clear sky. The granary rested quietly beyond it, strong and patient. The workshops clustered along one road where carpenters, potters, and basket weavers practiced their trades. Farther away, the river curved gently through the landscape like a ribbon of polished blue stone. Several small boats drifted across its surface. From this distance they moved so slowly that they seemed almost still. A fisherman standing in one of them lifted his net with careful strength. Water poured from its woven cords like tiny streams of silver. Sunlight sparkled for only a moment before the drops disappeared back into the Nile. Everything seemed connected. The boats carried fish to the village. The fishermen bought bread from the bakers. The bakers received grain from the granary. The grain came from the farmers. The farmers depended upon the river. The river fed them all. Nothing stood alone. As the afternoon slowly softened, Mena heard the steady tapping of wood upon wood. He followed the sound until he reached the workshop of a basket maker named Passeer. The open shelter smelled pleasantly of fresh reeds drying in the shade. Bundles of papyrus and river grasses leaned neatly against one wall. Half-finished baskets rested in careful rows upon the floor. Passeer sat cross-legged, weaving long strips of reed with patient fingers. His hands moved without hesitation. Over. Under. Pull gently. Turn. Repeat. The basket seemed to grow by itself. Mena watched quietly for several moments before speaking. You make it look easy. Passeer smiled without looking up. It only looks that way because I have been making baskets since I was smaller than your son. He continued weaving. When I was young, my grandfather would make me undo half my work. Why? So I would learn that careful work matters more than quick work. The basket maker paused to smooth one rough edge. A basket that carries grain must not have loose spaces. Mena nodded. A few small gaps become many missing kernels. Passeer looked up with a gentle smile. Exactly. The words settled into Mena's thoughts. Another quiet lesson. Another reminder that little things mattered. A basket was not ruined by one careless reed. But enough careless reeds together could change everything. The mystery of the missing grain seemed to appear everywhere now, not as a problem but as a teacher. It whispered through the baker's careful measuring. The farmer's steady watering. The fisherman's repaired net. The basket maker's patient weaving. Every craft depended upon attention to small details. Outside the workshop, two young girls gathered bundles of fresh reeds from a cart. They sorted them by length before carrying them inside. One noticed a cracked reed and placed it gently to one side. Her older sister nodded. Not for baskets. What will we use it for? The fire. Nothing was wasted. The cracked reed would warm the bakery oven. Ash from the oven would later enrich the garden soil. The gardens would grow herbs. The herbs would season tomorrow's meal. Life flowed in quiet circles. As the sun drifted lower, the heat became gentler. Long shadows stretched across the fields once again. The air filled with the comforting smell of baked earth cooling after another long day. Mena began the slow walk back toward the granary. The gray cat was awake now. It sat proudly beside the doorway, watching the road with calm yellow eyes. Children passing by greeted it as though it were another villager. One little girl placed a small saucer of water in the shade. The cat sniffed it politely before taking several slow drinks. The girl smiled. My father says you guard our bread. The cat, of course, gave no answer. It simply blinked once and returned its attention to the quiet world around it. Mena smiled too. Perhaps every village needed quiet guardians. Some carried writing tablets. Some carried fishing nets. Some carried baskets. Some watched the grain from a sunny doorstep without asking for thanks. He stepped once more into the cool stillness of the granary. The room felt peaceful. The baskets rested in neat rows. The floor remained clean. A faint scent of barley lingered in the air. He ran his hand gently across the smooth surface of one woven basket. Its reeds felt firm beneath his fingertips. Well made. Carefully used. Ready for many more seasons. Outside, the afternoon slowly leaned toward evening. The voices of workers returning from the fields drifted softly through the doorway, joined by the distant laughter of children and the familiar call of birds settling among the reeds. The Nile continued its endless journey beyond the village, calm and untroubled, carrying with it another quiet day in ancient Egypt, where the smallest acts of care, repeated with patience, quietly sustained the lives of everyone who called its banks home. The light of late afternoon became softer with every passing moment. The bright white glow of midday slowly turned to warm shades of gold that rested gently upon the fields. The barley swayed in the evening breeze, each stalk moving with quiet grace, as though the land itself had grown peaceful after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. Workers began making their way home. From the distant fields came the slow creaking of wooden carts carrying empty baskets. Oxen walked patiently along familiar paths, their steady hooves raising small clouds of fine dust that drifted lazily through the warm air before settling once again upon the road. No one hurried them. The day's labor was finished. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. Mena remained at the doorway of the granary, watching the gentle procession. One by one, the farmers passed by. Each offered a quiet greeting. Some carried wooden hoes across their shoulders. Others balanced bundles of reeds collected beside the canals. A few walked with their children, who had spent the afternoon gathering herbs, watching goats, or helping carry drinking water into the fields. Their voices were soft. Tired, but content. There is a special kind of peace that comes after honest work. It settles into tired muscles and quiet minds. It asks for nothing except rest. The gray cat stretched beneath the shade of the granary wall. It arched its back, blinked slowly toward the fading sunlight, and wandered unhurriedly toward the bakery, perhaps hoping that a kind baker might spare a small piece of fish or a warm scrap of bread. Mena smiled as he watched it disappear around the corner. "You have earned your evening," he murmured. Beck stepped outside carrying the final writing tablet of the day. "I believe our work is finished. For today." Beck nodded. "There is always another sunrise." "There always is." Together they secured the heavy wooden doors. The thick beam settled into place with a deep wooden sound that echoed softly through the quiet street. The grain would rest peacefully through another night. The two men walked side by side toward the river. Neither felt much need to speak. Good company often welcomed silence. The path curved gently between rows of mud brick homes whose walls glowed warmly beneath the lowering sun. Outside one doorway, an elderly woman sat spinning flax into thread. The spindle turned slowly between her fingers. Twist. Pull. Turn again. Her movements were almost hypnotic. Nearby, her granddaughter watched carefully, trying to copy the same gentle rhythm. The thread broke. The little girl sighed. The grandmother smiled kindly. Again. Without complaint, the child joined the ends together and began once more. This time her hands moved more slowly. The thread held. The old woman nodded with quiet satisfaction. Nothing good enjoys being hurried. Mena heard the words as he passed. He carried them with him. Another simple lesson. Another quiet truth. By the time they reached the Nile, the sun was touching the western horizon. Its reflection stretched across the water like a path of molten copper. Fishing boats were returning. Their long shadows drifted beside them. Some boats carried baskets filled with fish that shimmered in the fading light. Others had smaller catches. None seemed disappointed. The fishermen understood that every day upon the river was different. An old fisherman named Keem greeted Beck with a cheerful wave. The river was generous. Beck looked into the basket. Several tilapia lay neatly arranged inside. A fine catch. Keem smiled. The river gave enough. He never said it had given much. Only enough. Enough was a word often spoken in the village. Enough bread. Enough rain. Enough grain. Enough fish. Enough shade beneath the palm trees. People who lived beside the Nile understood that enough was a peaceful blessing. They did not spend their days wishing every basket were larger. Instead, they gave thanks that the baskets were not empty. Along the shore, several children gathered smooth stones. They skipped them across the quiet water. One stone bounced 3 times. Another only once. Each splash sent gentle circles spreading across the calm surface before disappearing. A young boy looked disappointed. His grandfather rested a hand upon his shoulder. The river keeps every stone. The good ones too. Especially the good ones. The boy smiled. He threw another stone. This one skipped 4 times. He laughed quietly. His grandfather laughed with him. The evening breeze carried their voices away across the reeds. Mena found a familiar place beneath a broad sycamore fig tree whose roots reached almost to the water. He often sat there at sunset. The tree had stood beside the river longer than anyone in the village could remember. Its wide branches offered generous shade during the day. Its leaves whispered softly whenever the breeze wandered through them. He settled onto the cool ground. Nearby, several women filled clay jars with fresh river water. They lowered each jar carefully beneath the surface before lifting it out with practiced strength. Drops of water sparkled briefly in the evening light. A pair of ibis birds wandered through the shallows, lifting their long legs slowly as they searched the muddy banks for small creatures hidden beneath the water. Farther downstream, buffalo stood quietly in the river, grateful for its cool embrace after the heat of the day. Everything moved gently. Everything belonged. Mena closed his eyes for a moment. He listened. The splash of oars. The rustling reeds. The distant lowing of cattle. The soft murmur of people finishing another day's work. A bird calling from somewhere among the palms. The quiet breathing of the river itself. It was impossible to separate one sound from another. Together they became the voice of the Nile. After a while, Beck spoke. You know. Mena opened his eyes. When you first mentioned the missing grain, I feared something much larger. So did I. Beck picked up a small smooth stone and rolled it gently between his fingers. But perhaps it was good that we looked. Mena nodded. We cleaned forgotten places. We repaired old habits. We counted more carefully. And we remembered that little things matter. Beck smiled. It was a useful mystery. The words settled peacefully between them. Neither man believed every question required worry. Some questions simply encouraged people to become more attentive. As the sun finally disappeared beyond the western desert, the sky slowly changed once again. Orange faded into rose. Rose softened into violet. The first bright star appeared above the eastern horizon. One by one, countless others followed. The river reflected them quietly. Nearby, the fishermen began securing their boats for the night. Ropes were tied. Nets folded. Paddles laid neatly inside each vessel. Nothing was left carelessly behind. The habits of the day continued into the evening. Care, order, patience. These simple qualities touched every corner of village life. Men arose slowly. The evening air had grown pleasantly cool. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward between the rooftops. The comforting smell of fresh bread returned once more, joined now by roasting fish and herbs warming over clay stoves. Families were gathering. Children would soon become sleepy. Stories would be told. Oil lamps would flicker gently inside mud brick homes. Another peaceful night would settle beside the Nile. As Menno began the familiar walk home beneath the first stars, he glanced once toward the granary standing quietly in the distance. Its sturdy walls rested peacefully beneath the evening sky, holding not only baskets of barley and wheat, but also the quiet trust of an entire village. And with each careful day that passed, that trust, like the grain itself, was tended little by little, by ordinary hands performing ordinary tasks with extraordinary patience, allowing life along the ancient river to continue in its calm and timeless rhythm. The night grew wonderfully quiet. The last cooking fire slowly settled into glowing embers, sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the cool air above the village. One by one, the small oil lamps behind mud brick windows became dimmer until only a few remained, their gentle light flickering softly like tiny stars resting upon the earth. The streets were empty now. The sandals that had crossed them all day were still. The carts stood quietly beside their homes. The oxen rested peacefully after another long day beneath the warm Egyptian sun. Even the birds had tucked themselves safely among the reeds and palm branches, where the night breeze rocked them ever so gently. The Nile continued its endless journey. It asked for no applause. It carried no hurry. Its calm waters slipped silently past sleeping villages, quiet temples, hidden marshes, and fields that would awaken once more with the first light of dawn. Moonlight stretched across its surface in long silver ribbons. Every ripple caught a little of the sky before letting it drift away again. Menno stood for a final moment outside the granary. The heavy wooden doors were closed. The clay seals rested neatly across the entrance. Inside, the baskets of barley and wheat waited peacefully for tomorrow, protected by strong walls, careful records, and the quiet attention of those who understood that even the smallest things deserved gentle care. The mystery of the missing grain had never been a tale of thieves or great danger. Instead, it had become something softer. It had become a reminder. A reminder that life was woven together from countless small acts that often passed unnoticed. A baker leveling a measure of flour with steady hands. A farmer guiding cool water through a narrow canal. A fisherman repairing one small tear before it became a larger one. A basket maker weaving each reed with patience. A grandmother teaching a child not to hurry. A gray cat keeping silent watch beside the granary wall. A scribe pausing long enough to notice a few scattered kernels resting upon the floor. None of these moments seemed important by themselves. Yet together they formed the quiet strength of a village. Just as thousands of grains filled a basket, thousands of ordinary kindnesses filled a lifetime. Menno turned away from the granary and followed the familiar path home. The road felt cool beneath his sandals. The desert breeze carried the comforting scent of damp earth from the Nile mixed with the faint sweetness of baked bread that still lingered in the night air. Above him, the stars stretched farther than the eye could follow. The same stars had watched the first farmers plant beside the river. They had watched children grow into parents, and parents become grandparents. They had watched floods arrive and quietly retreat, harvest after harvest, year after year. Long after every footprint in the dust had vanished, the stars remained. Long after every season had passed into memory, the river continued to flow. At home, Mena found his family already asleep. The little oil lamp burned with only the smallest flame. He smiled gently, careful not to wake them. He placed his writing tablet upon its shelf. Tomorrow there would be fresh numbers to record. Fresh grain to measure. Fresh bread to smell as it came warm from the ovens before sunrise. Another ordinary day. Another peaceful day. And he found comfort in knowing that ordinary days were often the greatest gift of all. He lay down upon the woven mat. Outside, crickets sang quietly beneath the moonlight. Palm leaves whispered overhead. Far away, somewhere along the riverbank, a fisherman untied his small boat before dawn, while a baker quietly fed dry straw into a clay oven, and the first birds of morning stirred gently among the reeds. The ancient world never truly stood still. It simply moved so patiently that it almost seemed to. The Nile flowed. The fields waited. The grain ripened. The bread baked. Children laughed. Families rested. The stars watched. And somewhere in the peaceful silence of the sleeping village, the soft wind carried across the water, brushing the reeds with a whisper so gentle it was almost impossible to hear. It sounded like the quiet breath of history itself. May that ancient river continue flowing peacefully through your thoughts. May the warm desert wind grow softer with every passing moment. May the steady rhythm of sandals upon dusty paths fade gently into silence. And may the calm heart of old Egypt, resting forever beside the faithful Nile, carry you the rest of the way into a deep, quiet, and peaceful